now going to go ahead and get started on today's lecture. And I'm going to wish you a happy 4th of July. And that is what, in fact, I will be talking with you about today in the context of an ongoing lecture series about equality. And you will remember from the Declaration, of course, perhaps the most famous phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." And I've been reading about the Declaration and about that phrase. I've been reading a particular book I'll talk with you more about in a little bit, Danielle Allen's Our Declaration. She's a professor at Harvard University. And in it, she writes, and I think she's absolutely right, that no words about the significance of equality are more important than those few words written in the Declaration of Independence. And so it seems to me, given that we're in the midst of talking together about equality, this is a good occasion to spend a little bit of time thinking critically together about the significance of the Declaration of Independence. And so that is what I would like to do with you today. As our way of, in a sense, celebrating the 4th of July together, you will probably anticipate that my mode of celebration tends to be to think critically about the significance of this document at the moment. And so the relevance of July 4th in 2020, reflections on the Declaration, all men are created equal, is the subject matter for today. I'll just refresh your memory. We had transitioned last week into political philosophy, and we will continue with this week and next week in figuring out what it means to assert that all human beings are morally equal to each other, that all deserve equal concern and respect. How do we ground that intuition? How do we make sure that we are confident that we can defend it, and what are its implications? But in order to do that today with regard to the Declaration, I want to think more systematically about the Declaration. And I'm going to do that with a little help from Frederick Douglass, the great African-American abolitionist from the middle of the 19th century, and a recent work on this period. And I'll be talking more with you about that, but the work is Constituent Moments by Jason Frank. And then thinking also about what Abraham Lincoln did to revive or resuscitate the significance of the Declaration, and using Danielle Allen to help me think about that. So let me jump right in. And I want to start with this second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, and in particular, the first sentence of the second paragraph, right? And the first paragraph is kind of a preamble, and it says, right, we're ready for a divorce. We don't want to be part of the British Empire anymore, and therefore we have to declare to the public of humankind why it is that we believe we are justified in seeking our independence. And then the second paragraph begins with this ringing declaration. And I want to note to you that this is a single sentence, or I guess two sentences. And to note that Thomas Jefferson is the primary author of these words. And we have the draft, and I will go back to the draft in a minute to point out to you what it is that was and was not included in the final declaration, which was, of course, adapted by the Continental Congress, as opposed to what Jefferson initially included. But these are the words that I think ring through human history from 1776 to the present, with such significance and clarity. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I would point out to you the audacity of this declaration, right? And please note that this is a declaration that is breaking with a monarchy, right? A monarchy is a rule, a form of government in which one man is elevated above all the rest, and is elevated because they have, quote, a divine or God-given right to rule because they are of a different order. That the very institution of monarchy is a holdover of a worldview in which, in fact, all men are not created equal, but some men are closer to God and some men are further from God, and some men are so unequal, so superior, that they should be entitled to the unilateral right to rule all other men. And Jefferson and the founders declare it self-evidently false, that the very principle of the British Constitution as it exists in 1776 is self-evidently false, and that the alternative proposition that all men are created equal and that they have rights, including the right to liberty and to pursue happiness in the way that they see fit, that those rights are self-evident, is just a bold declaration of something that certainly is not, in fact, apparent to all their peers. And so I just want to start, we may learn this in school from such an early age that we come to think of it as being simply accepted, right? Of course, everybody believes this. This was at its time an epic-making assertion, an assertion that the aristocratic and feudal and hierarchical past, which was described as the great chain of being in which some are at the top and some are at the bottom, had ended, and that a new society was going to be brought forth, founded on a new proposition. And you can probably hear in the way I'm expressing it, Lincoln's effort to resuscitate the Declaration. So then the Declaration moves on very quickly to draw out the implications of this fundamental assertion of equality and equal liberty for all human beings. It asserts that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. And again, I just want to unpack this for a moment, because it probably rings quite familiar to us, but this is a dense exposition of the implications that all humans are equal and equal in their liberty. If that is the case, then government has to protect their unalienable rights, and the people themselves minimally has the power to consent to the form of government that will coercively impose and regulate their collective life. But more than that, if government violates the consent of the governed, or does not respect their unalienable rights, then the people is entitled to alter or abolish it. And please note that in the past, in the British Revolution of the middle of the 17th century, so 100+ years before this was written, there was, in a sense, a common law or Republican right to revolution, but that right to revolution was seen as a restorative act. The right to, when government became corrupt, throw it out of power so as to restore the Constitution. This is a different assertion. This is an assertion that, in a sense, I'm not sure the founders fully understood the power of the words that they were writing. But that what they wrote is that the people not only get to abolish, but to institute a new government. And so when Jason Frank writes a book about, and I'm trying to get the title close enough so that you can see it, Constituent Moments, he's referring to the constitutive power of the people, which is the people's power to constitute their government and to reconstitute it or constitute it anew if they are dissatisfied with it. And we are in the middle of a course. We've been at it for many weeks now, diagnosing how the United States has become a much more unequal society. And we've noted that we are unequal in income and wealth and status and health, and that this is interfering with all aspects of social health in the United States. But I would also emphasize at this point that we've discussed the fact that we are unequal politically as well, that the vast majority of the financing of political campaigns, both direct and indirect, comes from a very few, less than 1,000 of the wealthiest families in the country, that these very wealthy individuals have disproportionate influence on our political system. And so one of the questions we need to be thinking about is, can we address economic or social inequality without also addressing political inequality? And if we, the people, have the right to constitute our government, when our form of government becomes one that we can no longer consent to, how should that right be exercised here and now? And so I'll return to this theme in a few minutes, but I do think, again, that when we read the Declaration of Independence, not simply as a schoolboy's exercise, but as a document with critical import in the 21st century, we then may see that it in fact has relevance to the way in which we think about the problems of inequality, democracy, legitimacy, and justice here and now in 2020. All right, so let me now move into Jefferson's draft of the Declaration. And there was a passage, there were multiple passages in Jefferson's draft that were omitted, but there's one passage in particular that I want to call your attention to. And this is in what might be called the Bill of Complaints. And the Bill of Complaints targets the king, right? And this is one of the complaints against the king that Jefferson included in the original draft that was omitted from the final draft. So let me read it to you and then discuss it for a moment. He, the king, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This peritical right? Piratical warfare. The opprobrium of infidel powers is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguishing dye, he is now exciting to those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, and murder the people upon whom he has also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one another with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. All right, so the first thing to notice about this, of course, is that Jefferson needed a good editor. And he found that editor in Benjamin Franklin and the committee that took his draft and excised this passage. I'll get into that, but simplified his language. The language here is too complex and too convoluted to do the work that the document that he was authoring needed to do. But let us not spend too much time criticizing Jefferson's prose and instead focus on what he's actually saying. And there are, I think, at least three things worth noticing about this passage. The first is that among the crimes that the King of England is indicted for in Jefferson's draft is slavery. And that, in a sense, the implication of the opening phrase that all men are created equal is clearly drawn out in this passage. If all men are created equal, then obviously slavery is an abomination, a deep injustice, a crime against humanity. And in the end, this passage was excised because, of course, half of the colonies were slave owning. And so they were unwilling to contain this. They would not have united around this document had it contained this declaration. But clearly, this is the implication of the opening salvo of the declaration, which was allowed to stand, and no doubt many who signed it and would not have signed it were they forced to also sign on to this clause, were nevertheless aware that this was in Jefferson's original text and that this was part of the Declaration. And I should say the implication of the idea that all men are created equal. And so it's worthwhile noting, in a sense, the additional radicalness of the Declaration of Independence. It's not only an indication that the era of aristocracy, nobility, monarchy, hierarchy has come to an end. It's also a shot across the bow in the American colonies to say that if we believe this, then slavery too cannot stand, right? So that's the first thing to notice. The second thing to notice is that, in a sense, what really draws Jefferson's ire and what is perhaps the reason this is really in the Declaration is that the king and several of his appointed colonial rulers had declared to African American slaves that if they were to fight on the side of the British, they would be freed, right? And so there is a power play in which, not for the first time, certainly not for the last time, the freedom of African Americans becomes chess piece on the board of power politics between whites. And I just think, again, it's worthwhile noting that right, among the things that Jefferson is also accusing the king of doing is dangling freedom in front of the slaves in order to induce them to fight on the British side. And in a sense, you could ask then, well, if you object to that, why not free them? And that brings us to the third thing I want to observe, which is that Jefferson, in a sense, plainly embodies the deep hypocrisy on which this country was founded. Because the man who authors the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal," is not only also drawing out its implication with regards to slavery, but himself a slave owner. And in fact, his fortune, his standing, his ability to acquire the knowledge, the skill, but also the trappings that allows him to be such a dominant figure in the early years of the American Republic. And it's worthwhile noting how much we owe to him, not just the Declaration, but important aspects of the Constitution are inspired by Jefferson's work for the Constitution of Virginia, that he creates the University of Virginia. And in certain respects, the idea of a free education being a birthright of American citizens can be traced back to Jefferson. His deep debt to European Enlightenment has a profound influence on American culture. And yet all of that is purchased on the back of slavery, right? And so we cannot think America as we celebrate the 4th of July without confronting that foundational contradiction, that a society dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal is nevertheless also founded in and on slavery, and that even the man who authors those words is himself a slave owner. It will soon, in fact, be partnered with a slave, and does not, in fact, even emancipate his slaves, as George Washington did at the end of his life. So just want to note then the constitutive tension built in to the Declaration of Independence. And this then gets me to the text that really inspires today's lecture. And I would encourage you, if you haven't, to perhaps take a look at this. And this is the text of Frederick Douglass's, which is entitled, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" And it's given to an emancipation society on the 5th of July, 1852. And I'll just start by noting the obvious irony of the date, which is to say that for African Americans in 1852, the 4th of July was not a holiday to be celebrated. And even a freed man like Frederick Douglass, who of course purchased his own freedom, is not willing to celebrate the 4th of July as long as his people remain enslaved. And so this is a readily available document. Just Google it and you can get it. It's not particularly long. I will quote to you a single quotation. "What to the American slave is your 4th of July?" And please note, he's speaking to an entirely white audience. They have wanted him essentially just to be there, but not to address them. But he has refused and demanded that if he is going to come, he should be given the right to speak. And he is now speaking to them in a way that indicates a interesting sense of both connection and disconnection. Your 4th of July, not our 4th of July, right? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, right? So celebrating the Declaration of Independence while slavery remains in force is a sham. Douglass throws that at the face of the audience who's invited him to speak on the 4th of July. And I now want to elaborate this a little bit by drawing on this work, Constituent Moments by Jason Frank. And Frank teaches at Cornell University. He is the author of another book on E Pluribus Unum, on Pluribus, the authors of the Federalist Papers, and it's a wonderful study of the Federalist Papers. But this, which is his first book, to me remains his best, Constituent Moments in Acting the People in Post-Revolutionary America. Frank, by the way, is a professor at Cornell University, a named professor, and I think one of the most interesting political theorists of his generation. And I just want to speak for a minute about this book and about what he does with Frederick Douglass's address in this book. And so the book is about this idea that the revolution let out of the bottle a genie that it had a hard time getting back in. And that genie was the genie of the idea that the people have the constitutive power, the power to make government. And please note the paradox in this, which is to say that the people's power to make government cannot be fully institutionalized, right? Because if it's fully institutionalized, then the government is already made. And then the people have powers within the government that has now been fully constituted, but they do not have the power to constitute that government, right? And so what Frank is playing with is this tension in the notion of a constitutive power. On the one hand, the constitutive power is organized and exercised in the act of making a government. And on the other hand, the idea that the people has a constitutive power says that in a sense, they're extra institutional. Their power outside of institutions remains even after they have made those institutions. And so this is a history of what he calls post-revolutionary America. And it in fact goes from the 1780s and the debates around ratification of the Constitution all the way to the 1850s and 60s, and in fact concludes with an analysis of Frederick Douglass's address. And so for this long post-revolutionary period, Frank claims that the people kept alive the idea that they had the constitutive power and did not delegate that power, say, to the US Supreme Court exclusively in allowing them to arbitrate the meaning of the Constitution. This is the people's Constitution. And in particular, again and again, they claimed to speak, the people claimed to speak from a position and in a status that exceeded what the Constitution actually designated as citizenship. And so constitutive moments or constituent moments comes for Frank to have this additional implication. How is the people expanded? How are their rights expanded? So please note that for most of the states at the time of the founding, citizenship, full citizenship, suffrage was reserved, of course, to white European property owning men. And that over the course of the period that Jason Frank traces, it was expanded several times. and of course it's expanded several times more after the period that he's examining concludes, to include non-property owning men. That occurred gradually, completed with the Jacksonian Revolution, and then expanded again to include African Americans, and then expanded again to include women. And part of what Frank is pointing to is that at these moments, a people that is not yet authorized, a people that includes the non-property, that includes African Americans, that includes women, that perhaps also includes immigrants who do not yet have legal authorization to be in this society, that the people, the public, expands and claims for itself the right to reconstitute its authority, and in so doing, to reconstitute the very bounds of citizenship, to say who gets to be included as an authoritative member of the public. And in a sense, what Douglass is then doing in the 4th of July address is claiming a right, and he's claiming it performatively in the very performance that he's engaged in, which is a right to speak as an equal, as a co-equal member of the public, and to confront the injustice of American society. And I would point out to you that precisely this is happening at this moment. And I want to call your attention for a moment to an article that you may have seen already. This is the Sunday magazine, just last week, this last Sunday's Sunday magazine from the New York Times. And it's an article by Nicole Hannah-Jones, who I've spoken with you about before. She's also the author of the 1619 Project, which suggested that we use 2019, the 400th anniversary of the importation of slaves to the United States, as an opportunity to think about American history in terms of the centrality of slavery and racial oppression to that history. That in this new article, Nicole Hannah-Jones makes the case that African Americans have been systematically deprived of a fundamental aspect of equality, the right, the equal right to acquire property and to acquire wealth. And I think it's worthwhile noting that Jefferson, in fact, revises Locke in the Declaration and replaces property with the pursuit of happiness. So if we go back to the text for a moment, for the Lockean tradition, the tradition of John Locke that we discussed together last week when we discussed the works of Jeremy Waldron, that for Locke, it would have been life, liberty, and property. And Jefferson, following Benjamin Franklin's lead, substitutes the pursuit of happiness for property. But what, Frederick Douglass and Jason Frank and Nicole Hannah-Jones in particular are pointing to is that it's difficult to be fully equal if one is deprived of the right to acquire property. And so in this article, Nicole Hannah-Jones makes, I think, very powerfully an argument that is not hers alone by any stretch, which is if we are truly committed to the cause of Black Lives Matter, if we're truly committed to the idea that in 2020 in America, we need to address the problem not only of police violence against African Americans, but the problem that gives rise to that problem, which is the problem of underlying racial inequality, that we need then to confront the fact that African Americans have been systematically deprived the right to accumulate equal wealth across generations. I'm not going to give a whole lecture on that today. I would point you to Nicole Hannah-Jones' article, and I have talked with you about this at points before, that although we no longer have laws that indicate that African Americans are property and so cannot acquire property, or that allow for the pillage and plunder of African American property even after they have been emancipated, or that exclude African Americans from getting central benefits of, for instance, the GI Bill, which is how the vast majority of white homeowners came to be in a chain of descent that allowed them to acquire property in the fundamental store of wealth, that was not made available to African Americans due to federal housing policy. That in all of these ways, both deliberate and legislative, and perhaps not deliberate and structural, as a society, we have not lived up to Jefferson's Declaration. And in 2020, it is time, as we celebrate the 4th of July, to begin thinking about what's happening in our midst, which is that our African American fellow citizens are claiming and demanding that, again, we expand the bounds of citizenship in order to live up to the meaning of equality. All right, so that's a little bit about the role of the Declaration in 1852 and the way in which it was invoked by Frederick Douglass. I next want to go to Lincoln and his effort to revive and resuscitate the meaning of this phrase. And so we can start with the idea that Douglass, in a sense, spits the Declaration back at his audience as a way of saying, if you believe these words, then you are hypocritical not to allow me to speak or not to have abolished slavery. And of course, Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address harkens back, and I think it's worthwhile remembering 77 years ago today, right? What does that refer to? That refers to 1776, not 1789, to the Declaration of Independence and not the Constitution. And in so doing, much in the same way that Jefferson is almost secreting a radical proposition into the Declaration by saying we hold this to be self-evident, when in fact it's a radical proposition, Lincoln is implicitly saying the right way to date the founding of the Republic is to go back to 1776, not 1789, as was the common practice in the 19th century. So that's the very first thing to notice. But then notice also that in going back to 1776, Lincoln spotlights that essential phrase from the Declaration. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, right? And so we get, again, Jefferson's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but the spotlight is on the proposition which Lincoln suggests is the founding proposition of our society, that all men are created equal. And he notes that the war that is in the midst of being conducted is a war about the meaning of that declaration and about the capacity of the United States to actually act in good faith on Jefferson and the founders' proposition, something that it had failed to do up until this point, in which Douglass had rightly held us to account for failing to do, and something that Lincoln hopes that will become the new charter of the United States in the aftermath of the Civil War. We know that history, and we know that, in fact, that has not yet occurred. But we also know that we are in the middle of a struggle right now in our society to better live up to that proposition. So having looked for a minute at Lincoln and at Douglas, let me conclude for a few minutes by talking about final work. And this is one that I recommend to you without reservation. I think it's a both deep, penetrating, important meditation on the Declaration of Independence, and at the same time, quite accessible, quite well written. It's a work of political philosophy that is meant to be also the work of a public intellectual. And the author is Danielle Allen. She's a professor of political theory at Harvard University. She teaches in the government department there and also at the Kennedy School of Government, the public policy school, where she directs the Edward Safra Center for Ethics, which is a center I've been affiliated with long in the past before she got there, and that I think does tremendously good work in bringing a group of scholars every year to do work together that is dedicated to the public relevance of political philosophy and kindred disciplines. Danielle is the author of multiple books, and she's trained in classical philosophy and looked in her initial book at Greco-Roman practices of punishment. She's spent a lot of time writing about education and what equality in education means in this country and how we continue to fail to live up to that idea. And again, if we were to point to our failure to adequately act on the basis of Jefferson's Declaration, I think the fact that most African-American kids attend schools that are dominantly people of color, children of color, right? 90, 95, 98% non-white in the schools that African Americans attend in the United States today. The vast majority of white kids attend schools that are dominantly white schools, and that the funding of those schools is strongly disproportionate. I teach at a college that is located in Yonkers, but the part of Yonkers that calls itself Bronxville, right? It's a Yonkers municipality, Bronxville, PO. And I've happened to look, how much does Yonkers spend per pupil on its kids? How much does Bronxville spend per pupil on its kids? And it turns out that Bronxville spends about 3 times as much per student per year on education as Yonkers does. And so again, how do we think of our society as a society founded on the proposition that all men are created equal when we afford such disparate resources to our children long before it can be said that they have earned, deserved, merited different treatment? All right, so very briefly, because I am starting to run out of time here, let me just talk about Allen's work here for a moment. And it is a sweeping work, and it is one that pays precise attention to the language of the Declaration and suggests that you cannot read the Declaration without highlighting and really appreciating the foundational significance of the idea of equality. And so she points out that for much of the last 50 years, we have been thinking about the United States primarily in terms of the value of liberty. She points out that Mitt Romney and Barack Obama had the final presidential debate of the 2012 presidential campaign in the Constitution Center in Philadelphia. And they did so underneath the words that I just read out to you. And that Mitt Romney turned to those words and read them out loud and then focused on the idea of liberty and paid absolutely no attention to the proposition that all men are created equal. And that Barack Obama, his opponent, did not point this out and did not return to the idea of equality. She takes this as symbolic of American political culture since Ronald Reagan, that we've become much more libertarian. And she points out that in Jefferson's original language, and let me return us for a moment to that language, that Jefferson is implicitly connecting liberty with equality and our fundamental rights. And his claim is that we cannot really be free in the absence of a government that protects our equal liberty, that we are only capable of securing that liberty as a collective accomplishment, as a common enterprise. And in order to be able to engage in that enterprise, we need to be treated equally. And that equal treatment includes, on the one hand, obviously affording equal rights to all persons and making sure that those rights in the law that is the structure that secures those rights is in fact administered in a way that treats all within our society equally. And Alan is attentive to the power of the language of this document, and then to the need for all citizens to have command over language in a way that allows them to be equally eloquent in defending their own interests and rights. And this is the bridge then from the idea of equality to an equal right to education, which again, I would suggest is another central project of the 21st century, of the 4th of July and Black Lives Matters and our presidential campaign that we are in the middle of. I am going to stop there and see if you have questions or themes that you want to discuss. We have 5 or 10 minutes. So who would like to start us off? I'm going to unmute everybody so that you can go ahead and, we've got a nice attendance today. Who wants to start us off?
Well, I will start off to compliment you on this wonderful presentation. I grew up in Canada and I was totally unaware of the history of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And this was a wonderful lecture for me to have attended. So thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And as I said, there's a schoolboy's version of this, a school child's version of this, which is you hear these words and they're just, the poster on the wall, but there's a history behind them, and it's not just the history of their drafting, and that matters a great deal. And if we wanted to fully go into that history, Jefferson was writing about this stuff years before, and that's part of the reason that he was assigned to the committee that drafted the Declaration. But there's also the history of Frederick Douglass. There's also the history of Abraham Lincoln. And there's also the history of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who goes back to this idea and again tries to anchor his project in the New Deal in Jefferson's proposition. So yes, there's a detailed, important interesting political history that we could gloss over if all we think about is fireworks and barbecue on the 4th of July. Not that we shouldn't do that, and I hope you will enjoy that, but that we should also be critically about what it is we're actually celebrating.
Professor?
But there is a little hook. All men are created equal, but.
Yeah, yes. And obviously we need to revise that. It's not just men, right? Yeah.
Yes. So we're watching on July 3rd, Hamilton.
Nobody hears me, of course.
I'll come back. I do hear you, but I want to hear what Susan says too. So I'll let Susan start.
We're watching
Yes,
Hamilton
but it's time
tomorrow.
for somebody else.
So I wanted to just share your thoughts with the community about how Hamilton is it a representation of what actually happened, or is it just, theater?
So I'm not well qualified to speak on this because I haven't seen it, but I have seen Lin-Manuel interviewed, and I do know that he did a lot of historical research, and I have read some of the books that he based his research on. Now there are things that I happen to know also about the biography. For instance, the duel which ends Hamilton's life, right? Hamilton shot above Burr at a branch, hit the branch to essentially, I believe, this is controversial to say, I could have killed you. I'm a good enough shot, right? But I did it. But did Burr misinterpret that as Hamilton shooting at him and trying to kill him, right? And in which case he was justified in killing Hamilton. In the musical, Hamilton puts his gun in the air, I believe, if I've got it right. And so there's some poetic license. Don't take this as pure history. Okay. This is a poetic and beautiful and deep and important reinterpretation of history. And please note that when Abraham Lincoln goes back and points to Jefferson in the Gettysburg Address, he is selective, right? He doesn't note that it's Jefferson who was a slave owner who is the author. And please note that 10 out of the first dozen of America's presidents were slave owners, right? And so, we sometimes use our past for our present purposes. And when we do that, we don't seek to be historians. We seek to retrieve from the past that which has present relevance. And that's what I think Hamilton is doing. And I'm really happy that you're going to be able to see it. I hope I'll be able to see it as well. I know it's being televised, and I know that the Times at least thinks very highly of the television production of it. All right, so I know there was somebody else trying to speak. Who was trying to come in?
It was Harriet that asked.
It's enough.
I thought it was Cynthia that wanted to speak.
Okay.
Cynthia wants to say thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. Go ahead, please.
I thought that I was really so pleased to be able to hear you this time. I missed you at other times because of the phone, but I thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Cynthia. That's very nice.
I ask my question. I'd like
so go ahead. Who is this?
This is Harriet.
Go ahead, Harriet, please.
Okay. This may
and then Lois, I'll come to you. I can see you raising your hand as well.
This may be very simplistic, but what is the rationale for, in Thomas Jefferson's mind, obviously, for owning slaves? What was his rationale after writing the Declaration of Independence? All men are created equal, unless he was only talking about that we're not under a monarchy anymore.
No, but note what he wrote about slavery, right? And so This
So
is
what was his thinking? Yeah.
Yeah, this is a profoundly difficult question to answer.
Okay.
And there's a wonderful book on this, the Hemmings of Virginia. Give me a second. I'm going to get the author's name for you because it's slipping my mind. It won the Pulitzer Prize. And I'm not happy with myself that I can't remember it, but I'll get it for you. The Hemmings of Virginia. Sorry, but to come back to your question, it's not only the case that, I'm sorry, the title of the book is The Hemmings of Monticello by Annette Gordon Reeves. It's a wonderful book, and in a sense, it is a critical biography of Jefferson, as well as Sally Hemings, who was his lover after his wife died, and her brothers worked very closely with him. She was a half-sister of Jefferson's wife, right? And so Jefferson, in certain respects, treated the Hemings better than many Virginian slave holders treated their slaves. But he didn't treat all of his slaves well. And in fact, he was very committed to getting maximal efficiency out of the slave labor and the plantation that it that required that labor. And so he was, in fact, dedicated to managing them to make sure that he got maximal productivity out of them. I think that Jefferson, in a sense, was, I'm going to struggle a little bit. And I have to point out, it should be clear from today's lecture, I've got a great deal of admiration for Jefferson, but he was a hypocrite. He was someone who knew that slavery was an abomination, but he was also somebody who had racist beliefs and who defended those racist beliefs in various of his writings, who seemed to, in part, be convinced by some of what would be called the anthropology of the day, that there were fundamental differences between whites and Africans, the fact between Europeans and Africans, the fact that his lifelong partner was an African American, notwithstanding, right, and was a quite impressive woman in many respects. So all that to say, Jefferson needed, for his station in life and to maintain his standard of living, to continue to hold his slaves, and he did that. And so I don't think it's defensible. I think it's hypocritical. And I think, in a sense, he should have known better. And he turned for support to racist ideology. And again, I think if there's something constructive to be gotten out of this, it's thinking about the relevance of this for the present. You know, we can say Black Lives Matter. We can say we're opposed to racial violence being carried out by the police. We can say that we're in favor of equality. But if it becomes inconvenient for us to do what's required, if the people of Bronxville should really abolish their separate school district and combine with Yonkers so that the kids of Yonkers and the kids of Bronxville get the same resources, right? Is that going to happen?
No.
If it's not going to happen, why is it not going to happen? If it's not going to happen, are the people of Bronxville, in certain respects, reenacting Jefferson's hypocrisy in a very different context? Obviously, they're not enslaving people, but they're nevertheless not fully acting on the basis of the commitment to equality. All right. I hope that helps. And it's a complicated theme. Go ahead.
Could you give me the name of the book again? our Constitution?
Hello?
Yes, our Constitution, and the author is Danielle Allen.
Danielle.
Yeah. I know, let me see, Lois, you had a question, right? I saw you raising your hand. I'm trying to unmute you. I think you're going to have to unmute yourself by holding down your space bar. Lois, do you want to go ahead?
Anyway, so you answered my question that Thomas Jefferson was hypocritical, right?
Yes. Oh, okay. That was your question. Okay. And Lois,
Okay.
I did send you an email. I owe you some citations.
Okay.
I know.
I'm on to another book, but my question to you, when Jefferson writes life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, or whatever that is, why does he have to separate life, what is the difference in his mind between life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Why does he write all three? Why do you know what I'm trying to say, or am I confused? I'm not confused.
If you have liberty, you have the pursuit of happiness, right?
Yeah.
If they're all the same thing, but they can't be in his mind the same thing, or he wouldn't.
They're not the same. They're not the same.
Just a second.
Yeah, and
I want to know why they're not the same, because he's writing them that they're the same.
Yeah, no, I don't think he's in a sense compounding them together. So there is a tradition that goes back to John Locke of thinking about life, liberty, and property.
Right.
And by the way, by property, Locke didn't mean the possession of the external world. He actually meant self-possession, control over oneself, as well as control then over the products of one's labor, which then eventually leads to control of the external world. But what each of those terms is doing, if I can just unpack them for a moment. Life is essentially saying, right, that we need to have basic physical security. And in the context of the revolution, I think it's worthwhile noting that the town we refer to as Portland, Maine now had just been razed to the ground by the British, right? And the British supporters in the United States, that the British troops were being housed in our houses, that they were firing on us. And so physical security is one of these essential needs. Liberty is much more extensive than physical security. It includes, of course, physical security, but it also includes having those rights, the right to speak, the right to associate, the right to practice one's religion, that are eventually enumerated and put into the Bill of Rights as amendments to the original Constitution. And pursuit of happiness, finally, refers to the idea that each of us uses those rights in our own way to define from within what matters to us, what's significant for us, what makes life worth living for us, and pursuit of happiness, right? Not happiness. We may make mistakes. We may do stupid things. We may be confused. But in a sense, what the idea of the pursuit of happiness says is that each person should have the ability to make those mistakes, because leading your own life is what's most significant, what fully humanizes you, what develops and cultivates your humanity, is the project of figuring out for yourself how you're going to pursue happiness for you. Does that help?
Yeah, but where does equality fit into that, or doesn't it?
Well, equality is in a sense the foundation of all of this, in suggesting that every person has those rights, and that in a sense, liberty is only secure, life is only secure, the pursuit of happiness is only possible in a society that makes those rights equally available to all its citizens. And so in this sense, rather than there being a competition between equality and liberty, I believe Jefferson is suggesting, as Danielle Allen suggests he is, that they are inextricably connected to each other. That liberty is only secure in a community that makes it equally available to all persons.
Okay.
All right, everyone. Great questions. Thank you for the kind words.
When will you be back?
Next week.
I think having it upstairs as a community would be very beneficial.
Well, Susan and I will keep talking about that. It would be on the big screen upstairs.
Oh,
I
yes.
will not come there in person
know.
and talk
Yeah.
to you through a mask and risk bringing the virus.
That would be a
But
good
I
idea.
will continue to talk with Susan and see what we can do logistically to allow you all to come together. I would get some pleasure out of seeing you assembled as opposed to seeing you each in your own room.
Would it be
All right,
next
everybody. Take care. Have
Okay.
good weeks. Be
Thank you.
safe. Be smart. Enjoy the holiday. And I'll see you next week.
I'm going to have the pursuit of my
And the
happiness.
big-
Yes, exactly.
I'm going to see my son.
Nice. Okay. Take
Oh,
care.
yeah, big screen.